Murder remains murder. And that's why the national crisis we're facing is so complex. How did the man accused of murdering Molly Ticehurst get bail, despite already facing charges of raping and stalking her? We saw from the rallies at the weekend the hurt, the anger the whole country is feeling. So how do we change it? We ask the people who have lived it. Kim O'Reilly is a domestic violence survivor, and Tarang Chawla's sister Nikki was murdered by her former partner in 2015. Thanks to both of you. Kim, the rallies, every big city, so many tiny towns. What was it like to walk the streets with so much support?
I mean, it was incredible. It was so moving. The turnout was fantastic. There was a lot of emotion, whether that was frustration, anger, sadness, all sorts of feelings, but it was a really strong message. All of us that showed up really had a strong message, and that is enough is enough.
Do you think our politicians, the ones who impact what our policies and standings are, do you think they understand how fearful women are, Kim?
Not at all. I think that's why we've still got this problem, and it's getting worse and worse. We don't have any outcomes. We haven't had any solutions. I don't think they understand because they haven't been affected by it.
How about you, Tarang? I mean, your sister Nikki was murdered the same night her partner found out she was leaving him. She was 23 and that was 9 years ago. What's changed?
What's changed, Ali, is that we're talking about it now. But talk is cheap, and talk won't bring back the lives of the 32 women that have been killed this year. Talk is very little comfort to those families, the loved ones who will always now at Christmas lunch have an empty seat at that table, who will miss birthdays and anniversaries of their loved one. So we're talking about it, but we really need meaningful action from government. And I think we know what we need to do as a society, because the experts have been telling government for decades, and it's time for them to listen and to act.
How are you every time you hear that another woman has lost her life to this? When you said 9 years ago that you were adamant that you didn't want to see any other family go through what yours went through?
It's utterly heartbreaking, Ali. Every single time you see a woman's face on the news and you look at the story of how she lived her life, and then seeing how certain parts of the media may label the person who took her life as being a good bloke, or hearing about his career aspirations, it's heartbreaking. And then I look at my parents who had the very tragic reality of having to attend the funeral of their only daughter. And I think of how many families across the country are having to go through the same thing. And that's the greatest loss. The loss for a parent of a child to men's violence is just utterly heartbreaking. And so I share that empathy for families all across Australia.
And in many ways, I'm sorry to ask both of you to come on and to share what you've gone through again, but I feel like the lessons you've learnt and what you've gone through and your experiences, there is so much we can take from that. And Tarang, you said that there was an escalation 3 months before her murder, which you've described as a missed opportunity. What happened and how was it handled?
So about 3 months before my sister was murdered, Ali, the man who took her life, her then partner, was brandishing a big knife at home, and he was threatening either harming her or self-harm. And my sister didn't know what to do. How would anyone know what to do when a person that professes to love them is waving a knife around and saying things that are unhinged and causing you such great distress and fear? And she reported it to authorities, and it was suggested that he undergo anger management and counselling, and nothing came of that. You know, that's such a missed opportunity that had someone intervened properly, my sister wouldn't have been forever young at 23. She would have been celebrating every birthday since and grown into the beautiful young woman that she should have always been able to grow into. So that was a missed opportunity.
Goodness me, had he potentially got help at that point, that maybe your sister would be here. And I look then to Kim, in your case, you're alive because neighbours heard your screams and police got there in time. He went to jail, but explain how hard you had to fight to keep him locked up.
Oh, I'm still fighting. You know, he's out on parole at the moment and is released fully after his sentence is finished in January next year. It is all about the perpetrator. It is not about us. We are not protected in any way through the legal system. And the sentence really is for us for life. It is not about them. It is about them getting a cancellation prize and rewarded for their good behaviour. But for a whole lifetime, we suffer with trauma.
And as you say that, we're looking at some of your injuries, which you gave us permission to show them. How often do you think back to that moment and how close you came to not being with us today?
Oh, daily. Every day, probably multiple times a day, I have an interaction and it will just trigger a memory. But I definitely go over it so many times and think about how lucky I was, or also how unlucky I was that I had to go through it.
And you're still going through it. Do you think for you that it ever ends?
Never. No, never. I'm definitely a different person. My life is definitely different in how I choose to live it and how I can live it, but it will never go away. It is a life sentence.
Well, you're forced to live in the shadows, aren't you? Always looking over your shoulder.
100%.
Yeah. You said he has served his sentence now. He's out on parole. What's it like knowing he's on parole? Do you feel safe?
Not at all. I haven't felt safe since the day I was told that he was getting out on parole. Yeah. His sentence is his sentence and he should have to do that. But, you know, unfortunately, this is the flaw in our system and he is out and I feel extremely unsafe and I will for the rest of my life.
And look, I think this goes to the very heart of the issue, right? Too many women don't feel safe. You're not being listened to. We don't learn from your experiences, and so it just keeps happening. Tarang, the Prime Minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting with the premiers on Wednesday. The only thing on the agenda will be domestic violence. What do you want to come from it?
I want this meeting of the Prime Minister and all the state and territory leaders to actually demonstrate to all of Australia what they plan to do. Now, the government has a 10-year action plan on reducing family violence. They've made commitments that in a generation or in 10 years they want to eradicate family violence. Now, if the numbers continue as they have every 4.5 days, we'll have over 90 women this year killed if that trend continues this year. And that is just utterly heartbreaking. So this Wednesday, I want them to say what they're actually going to do. You know, there's conversations about whether or not we should have a royal commission. Well, experts have been telling the government for decades to fully fund frontline services, to fully fund domestic violence shelters, to fully fund women's legal services, to provide appropriate supports to law enforcement to be able to deal with violent offenders, and to actually rethink what we mean around prevention. We talk about prevention as being men changing attitudes. Well, we can't wait a generation for men to change their attitudes. We actually need to do things now. So I really encourage the Prime Minister to put every option on the table on Wednesday and actually commit to meaningful change.
What do you think we'll see come from this meeting, Kim? I mean, we see how governments respond when there's, say, like a natural disaster or a terror attack. We see action, but I feel often with domestic violence, all we get is words. What do you want physically, practically to see come from it?
I want to know what they're going to do for safety for women once a perpetrator gets out of jail. I also want to know what prevention measures we can take to stop this from happening in the first place. And I want to know when it's going to be implemented and how it's going to be implemented and how can we improve it along the way. I don't want them to stand up there and tell us what the problem is. We already know what that is. I want to know what they are going to do about it.
So you would feel safer, say, ankle monitoring bracelets?
100%.
Yep. So at least
100%.
the police know where a certain person is at all times. Because, look, the reality is we can't lock everyone up. And, Tarang, you just touched on it about prevention and what that looks like. We need to have the women's refuges, the legal services there available for when they leave. What about in regards to the services available to these men? The men, so we can hold up that mirror, help them change their behaviour. Does anything exist in that space that either of you are aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. There are men's behaviour change programs, and often perpetrators or violent offenders are made to do these court-mandated programs. But the sector that deals with this will often say that they're not fully funded to be able to do their work, and they need to have appropriate funding because we can't lock everyone up. We need to acknowledge that there are men who are capable of rehabilitation, and we actually need to have the unglamorous conversation about what we're going to do to support support that rehabilitation, provided there's someone who has demonstrated that they are not a risk to the women that they used to be in a relationship with or the wider community. And so when those men are in those positions, they need to be supported to actually engage in those programs. But they're not being supported right now because the services aren't being funded appropriately.
And as you say, first things first is always someone's safety has to come first. And I'm really mindful of not demonising all men in this, but with violent men, right? I mean, it's not like they have it tattooed on their forehead. It's not always obvious. Do we need more men calling out bad behaviour? I'll go to you first, Tarang.
Absolutely, we need to see more men taking the lead. And, I looked at the sort of state and territory leaders and a lot of men in positions of power, the Prime Minister yesterday at the rally, wanting to show their solidarity. But the irony is, and Kim and I were speaking about this, the irony is that the rallies are there because people feel that government hasn't done enough historically. And so it's really up to all levels of government, of business, of sport, of community groups to see strong male leaders standing up. Because when it comes to these issues of respect for family, for others, these are really traditional masculine qualities. A lot of men get this sense that, not all men are violent. Well, we know that not all men are violent, but all men play a responsibility to help shape the attitudes. The problem is it's so urgent right now that we can't wait that long.
And look, and as you were speaking, I could see Kim nodding her head there. And Kim, this is close to your heart. And I wanted to give you the final word on it because I know while you were recovering from your horrific injuries, your attacker got bail and was black playing with his footy club, and they even wrote him character references, which goes entirely against exactly what Tarang was just saying there, that we need to call out bad behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, it's not great, and it is a male's problem, and males can't sit on the fence. They either need to be a part of the solution or they're definitely a part of the problem. And it needs to be called out. This masculinity, toxic masculinity, just isn't okay. We can't have people in role model positions accounting for other people when their behaviour is so toxic. We need to call it out, and we need to change our attitude in our community.
Well, Kim, too many women have had their voices permanently silenced, so I applaud you for standing up. And Tarang, you founded Not One More Nikki in honour of your sister, so I know that you'll fight on. Thank you both for coming on today.
Thanks, Ali.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Both such powerful forces, and I hope that their strength can be passed on to others, because there are really good people determined to make change, and our leaders, they need to listen to them. They're the ones who have lived through domestic violence, and what we heard just then makes a whole lot of sense. If you or someone you know is experiencing sexual abuse or family violence, there is help. Call 1800-RESPECT. That's 1800 737 732.